I'm going to just go ahead and start, if that's okay. So first, thank you guys for joining us early, for navigating this labyrinth and the weather outside. We appreciate it. We hope that you're going to the other sessions later today and that this is going to be the theme that sticks with you throughout the day. Thank you also to the folks in AV who are helping us out and the folks on Zoom. I'm Nellie Mecklenburg. As I mentioned, I'm going to moderate our small group. And we're going to do a round of introductions, but first, just going to situate us all in what the conversation is today. You probably saw the title, but that can mean a lot of different things. So we are 3 years later, still very much in the COVID pandemic, and it has been personally and socially and economically devastating, and it continues to be for many people on many levels. But at this point, we've also learned a few things. And I would say that one of the most important things that we've learned, that we've seen in our own work and in our own lives, and while it is still going on, we have learned some things at this point. And I was just saying that one of the things I think that we've learned, that we've really seen, is that communities and local organizations were the first line of response all over the world, whether in New York City or in Kenya or in Rwanda, everywhere. And they did that in lots of ways. Communities mobilized to share information with each other, but also with all of us. We relied really on them as our fact finders and our informants is not the great word, but as our partners in that way. They distributed resources. They stepped up when schools and other services were shut down or were overwhelmed, and they really took care of each other. And COVID has definitely put us back in terms of achieving the SDGs, but if it hadn't been for the efforts of communities, we would be much further behind. And I imagine if you are in this room right now, that this is not a surprise to you. I think a lot of, probably all of you, certainly the folks on Zoom, have been committed for a really long time to putting communities at the center of decision making, because we know that that's what works and we know that that's what's sustainable. But even knowing that COVID really pushed us to the edge, I would say, it made all of us have to work a lot harder to support local partners and communities. It made us have to confront the boundaries and barriers of the ways that we work and rethink our own systems in order to do that better. And COVID might be becoming sort of the new normal, but there will continue to be crises and communities will continue to be the frontline responders. And so we want to be better prepared, and we want to learn from what we've been through so that, next time we can mobilize faster. So today the point is to talk about what we've learned from the past 3 years, how we can really delegate decision-making power and resources and really shift the power, this term that we hear all the time. But what it looks like to do that, what it requires to do that, and what happens when we do that. And as I mentioned, to do that, we're going to have a community conversation in this room. We have 2 folks here with me as speakers, another 2 folks online. I'll introduce them in a minute, but I'm going to open up every question to all of you guys also. So we're hoping this is really a discussion. I'm sure that these are dynamics that you experienced in your own work, that you relied more on local partners during COVID. So you also have a lot of lessons to share. So with that, maybe we'll do fast introductions so that everybody in the room can introduce themselves. And actually, in that case, I'm going to let you all introduce, even you guys, if you don't mind, introduce yourselves rather than me introduce you.
Should we start with people?
Yeah, why don't we go first? Louise, do you want to speak first? Just quickly introduce yourself.
Yeah, no, good morning, everyone. It's really lovely to be here. My name is Louise Umutoni Bauer, and I'm the Policy Director at Spark Microgrants, an organization that works with communities in various countries on the continent, including Rwanda, where I am primarily from. Before joining Spark, I actually worked in the development space, particularly with the UK Department for International Development. And so it's been quite an interesting experience getting to the ground and actually working with communities. So I'll quickly stop here and potentially hand over to Zipporah, because I think we're the 219.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Zipporah Wambua, a Kenyan from one of the subnationals in the African continent, Makueni County specifically, and the Director Public Participation and Civic Engagement at the county. I am an expert in devolution and also what we call participatory development, a champion of the community-led development model in the country and in the county. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Vicky and Louise.
Everybody, Matthew Cruz. I work for Relief International. I'm the Senior Director of what's called Accountability, Impact, and Measurement. We tried to take traditional monitoring and evaluation a step further and make it fully focused on communities and accountability as the primary metric for impact. And prior to that, prior to being with RI for about 6 years, I was working in democracy and governance with the World Bank, infrastructure, et cetera. So everything really about generating community voice and empowerment.
Perfect. Okay, and then quickly before we go in, Movement for Community-Led Development was mentioned, so I'm going to just tell us about what we are. So we all, actually the extended group, are part of something called the Movement for Community-Led Development. The movement, or MCLD, was launched in 2015, actually the same day that the SDGs were launched, based on the very firm belief, or the knowledge really, that achieving the SDGs would only be possible if communities were in the driver's seat. And now, 8 years later, there are over 1,500, I think well over 1,500 local civil society organizations, and I think at this point, maybe even more than 80 international NGOs that are part of it. The heart, the core of the Movement for Community-Led Development is the national associations, which are groups of local civil society and country offices of NGOs that are working together at the national level to push forward on community-led development, and with secretariat support from the Hunger Project. And we have one more person joining us. The basic goal of the movement, for those of you that don't know it, is to scale community-led development in order to achieve the SDGs, and so that everyone has a voice in the decisions that affect their lives, so that everyone has access to equal and affordable public services and the financing that is needed to do that, and so that local civil society and local government work better together.
Also, if you leave your details afterwards, we can send you the slide deck.
Yeah, that's a good point. We can send you the slide deck and information to learn more about the movement.
Yes.
So the movement believes this is only possible through systems change that shifts power and resources to effective local institutions. As the graph notes, it works primarily through advocacy and facilitation. And one of those key ways is by setting up learning platforms or sharing platforms where members can brainstorm with each other, share lessons, and collaborate. And one of those that began in April 2020 was looking at the COVID-19 pandemic. And it was a space for members from all over the world to come together and talk about what they were facing and to work together to figure out some adaptations and solutions. So in the spirit of that learning exchange, let me go back to our folks online. There we are. What I am first curious to hear about is what happened in COVID. What changed in the ways that you guys worked with your teams and with your local partners, and how did that affect impact and partnerships? I'm going to start with our 4 speakers, but then I'm going to open the room. So please do take note of your thoughts. As I said, I'm sure these are dynamics that you guys experienced also. So Pablo, I'm going to start with you. You and your team, you're in touch with communities all the time. So what changed when the restrictions meant that your country teams couldn't travel, but also local government and other services couldn't go? How did communities adapt, and how did you and your team have to lean on them more?
We already lean on this model, working directly with local leadership, working with everyday community members, working with them through training to build them up to be co-implementers of our programs throughout the program lifecycle, and ideally at the end of the partnership, they continue forward and carry. So, when the pandemic hit and we weren't able to be directly in communities, but soon after started trying to reinitiate programs, we leaned almost totally on local partners to be the implementers, to be the folks that were actually engaging their own communities and driving these programs forward in a time where we couldn't be there physically present. And so for us, this was incredibly revealing vulnerabilities and inefficiencies of capacities and resources that are centralized outside of community. That this is not the most resilient strategy when we have those capacities centered outside, and that for the long term, these leaders should happen inside. And so for us, it was extremely revealing of that vulnerability. I think from a MEL perspective, or a monitoring and evaluation perspective, not only did we lean on communities for the implementation of programs, but also sharing information about what activities were occurring. And so this meant as programs were being implemented, relying on them to share what activities were actually occurring, how many people were actually participating in these activities, sort of further integrating them, not just in deployment of programs, but also the understanding of how these activities were occurring. And so this kind of deeper integration into monitoring also kind of evoked a little bit of self-consciousness on our end of what type of data we were collecting, the relevance of this data to community partners, how much of that data we were collecting and how much of it was necessary during a time when resources were constrained, and also how much of that data makes its way back into the community. So is it just kind of a one-way street outside, or does this being leveraged in any way by the communities themselves? And what we realized is that there was this sort of inconsistency in the way we approached community-led principles in programs. We would really emphasize community ownership and leadership in the implementation of programs, and how we understood and learned about programs and collected data on programs. And so since kind of that point, we've made changes to try and correct that inconsistency, really focusing much more on the integration of program or community partners, not just as sources of data or reporters or informants, but also thought partners and how we learn about the effectiveness and impact of our programs. We've also progressively tried to develop resources that focus more on the accessibility of data insights and that center voices in those learning conversations. So shifting this perspective of data collection and data as just sort of this funding resource, as this resource that's taken outside of the community, and trying to leverage data more as a community resource. And that was a direct learning of that process of further integrating them into the data collection process during the pandemic.
Thanks, Pablo. I also realized, Deborah, did you introduce yourself? I'm really sorry. Thank you. Sorry again about that. Zippy, online. I'm curious to hear from you. I mean, part of what the movement MCLD believes is that, I think I said this earlier, it takes a whole ecosystem of partnerships to really see communities in the lead and at the center of development and peace building. So I'm curious to hear from you, from the local government perspective, who are a critical part of this ecosystem. What changed for you and the way that you worked during COVID? And how did the relationships with communities change in terms of functions and roles and responsibilities, but also around the trust? How did it affect trust?
Thank you very much. As I said, my name is Zipporah Wambua from Makueni County, a subnational. From 2015, we were part of the launching of the Movement for Community-Led Development here in Kenya. At the same time, intensifying the localization of the Sustainable Development Goals. At the heat of the COVID-19, we had a lot of instability in terms of the community level, both from the education sector, the water sector, the health sector, and even the productive sectors like agriculture. The lockdowns and even the fear of accessing the medical services among communities, and shortage in terms of the supply, and as well as unemployment, was quite a challenge here in Kenya. As a subnational, there was a lot of changes that happened in terms of how do you reach these communities, how do you ensure that service delivery is accorded. And one of the key things that was at the front line was the issue of integration of technology in decision-making, availability of information at the community levels, and knowing that the COVID-19 had a lot of rules and protocols that ensured that communities do not meet, and not more than 15 also, and the challenge of meeting the threshold of public participation. But at the county level, what the change through the county government was ensuring that we have community volunteers that are able to be trained and be among the communities to be able to champion the agendas and the responsibilities, meaning that there was a shift in terms of some of the functions of government, and including some of the services by the government, and leading to volunteer and non-state actors and the civil society being more involved at the local grassroots level. For example, there was the community health volunteer strategy that was very much strengthened during the COVID-19 situation, so that we ensure between and among every household there is proper sanitation, there is proper education among communities, among those that are suffering and cannot access the hospitals and so forth. A key change within the county government was the change in how we do our budgeting and prioritization for budgeting. And in collaboration with the Movement for Community-Led Development, one of the key initiatives was to ensure that the budgets of the county are responsive to the needs, the changing needs of communities. And that included the current unemployment that was caused by COVID-19, the move to how do you deliver water, how do you deliver food sovereignty among the communities. And therefore, there was a change in terms of what we call here participatory budgeting. And through the support of the Movement for Community-Led Development was ensuring that each of the counties in Kenya at least allocate 20% of its budget to livelihoods, to community-led development programming, so that it gives the communities an opportunity for service delivery, an opportunity for employment, and an opportunity for them to even champion their own development. Going forward, we were able to devise ways of communication beyond physical communication, which was limited through COVID. And therefore, it led to what we call the use of bulk SMS systems, the use of social media platforms, including what we call WhatsApp, which was termed as very informal earlier before the COVID-19. And therefore, other initiatives like using the Zoom, including local communities being able to be challenged to be able to continue the public participation model. One of the key things that we learned during this period was the quest for knowledge. And that is why from 2021, we began the flagship project of the development of the county, the Kenya and the African actually School for Community-Led Development, which I'll be talking about in the next question. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. I didn't know about that either. I'm really excited to hear. Thank you also. I mean, it's interesting. We're already starting to see the different layers. I mean, from these real services, you know, budget allocations down to, as we've heard so far, the communication and the issues of trust. If you brought up issues around trust that came with COVID, because, you know, there was mobility was prevented, but there was also a lot of mistrust and fear that people were dealing with, and putting communities more in the center when they were, you know, they are trusted closer partners to other people around them, I think was part of the motivating factor. Matt, you've talked a lot to us about how the pandemic revealed some of the ways in which less is more, which I think is a really great phrasing. What do you mean by that? How did that play out for Relief International, which is a big global organization?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so Relief, we're in 16 countries, and we have kind of centered on, in addition to a lot of other crises, we've kind of centered on South Sudan, the Syria crisis, and the Rohingya crisis, which unfortunately the UN has forgotten about because of Ukraine, which is understandably a very big deal, but just because you have new emergencies doesn't mean that the old ones go away. So, so RI is basically 98% local and country staff, around 5,000 people versus 70 people at Global Support Office. And one of the things that we've always prided ourselves on is calling ourselves Global Support. We acknowledge that we are not headquarters. We are helping our country staff do their jobs to serve our communities, right? So we really try and check our egos at the door when it comes to who we are versus who they are. Like, they're working in extreme conditions, and so we have nothing but respect for them. And so that's what I've always respected about RI, is that we are global support. But given that, we still had a really heavy reliance on travel and in-country technical assistance, and that just came to a complete crushing halt. And so we really had to innovate, and we had to understand who were the thought owners in the country offices that maybe we weren't really aware of at that time. Like, were they leaning too much on us, or were we not empowering them to make those decisions, those innovative strategies on their own? So it was kind of self-defeating after a little bit, and we discovered those, and we had to have hard conversations about that. And another thing that we found, that you can actually do a lot remotely, unfortunately. Like, people in the country offices love it when we come to visit and support them, because they feel that it shows that we are truly caring about their work, and we do. But also we need, we gave ownership of a lot of key processes to them in a way that we hadn't had to before. So I think that was really valuable. And to Pablo's point, we had a lot of conversations about data, and donors. I'm to the point now where if a donor asks me to collect 100 data points and they cannot provide me 100 reasons why they're collecting, why we have to give them that data, I'm not going to collect it, right? Like, it's the time fatigue, and we're actually submitting a research project on time fatigue and data poverty for women in particular, because we spend so much time of their time collecting data we do not respect their time. And to Pablo's point, we don't even complete that feedback loop. And for RI, especially, so many of our staff are in the community, so it's basically neighbors, right? And so we were able to sort of take a step back and take a deep breath because of lockdowns that we just couldn't collect all the information. We're like, do we really have to? And is it dignified? Some of the new eco environmental indicators are insane. It's like you're going up to someone's house in South Sudan. And you're like, oh, how much did you recycle this year versus last year? I was like, I couldn't answer that, like even for myself. And basically my rule of thumb now is if you're not telling me that you're going to use it, and if it's not dignified to ask, I'm not going to ask it. Like imagine a stranger coming up to your house and saying, do you defecate in your house or in your yard? Like who would answer that? And I understand that some of those are necessary for some things, but there's better ways of doing it. And so I think that COVID allowed us to sort of take a step back, take a deep breath. And my 2023 resolution word for myself is intentionality. And I'm applying that for RI as well. You can intentionally do something, but you can also intentionally not do something. And that's really what we're trying to figure out. So, yeah.
That's great. Those are some really specific, concrete things. I'm curious. In a little later, I'm going to ask you about how, if RI, as I said, is like a big global organization, if they take some of these steps, what could that mean for the sector at large? And to the sector point, Louise, I'm curious to hear about Spark's experience, especially around the micro grants that you guys give, how the pandemic and the shutdown, and also as we brought up, information, trust, fear, how all of that came into play. But I'm also curious, from the sector level, what did all of this reveal about community-led or community-driven development and the role it can play?
Yeah, no, thanks, Nelly. So on our end, I have to say that our primary partners that we work with are communities. And so what came to the fore and affirms our initial thinking, and a lot of you here ascribe to the same thinking, is that we should trust our community members because they know much, much more about their own communities than we do. And so within our work, we realized that they were the best at identifying the most vulnerable people within the communities that we were working with. So, for example, with most of the communities we worked with, we provided a small relief grant of about $900 during that period. And one of the communities, this one within the northern part of the country, called Karingorera, they basically decided that they wanted to give this money that they were given to the most vulnerable within their community. And they quickly identified the elderly as the most disadvantaged at that point, and they sort of were very quick to channel those resources to them. And so we really, really got to see that, when we're thinking about programming, when we're thinking about targeting, etc., the communities are the best to engage in those types of conversations. And from the sort of more sectoral perspective, we also learned that, a lot of the work that organizations that are working within the community-driven, space, were much more likely to get resources to the most vulnerable during that period. And so the effort and time that had been spent building these systems, this sort of ecosystem of community-led development, that effort that had been put in came to the fore as well. And we were able to quickly get resources to the most vulnerable. I remember at the time actually having engaged with the existing sort of much bigger development institutions, government as well, and they were struggling to get resources to communities. They did not have the mechanisms and the systems in place to be able to get those resources further down. And whilst Spark was getting resources in all these different communities as quickly as possible, so that infrastructure as well is really critical. The type of infrastructure that is not very complicated, that doesn't require millions of sign-off points. We saw instances of corruption at the time when the resources were sort of flowing in, and it was a situation where resources had to go quickly. There were opportunities for corruption as well within different governments, but for organizations that had been working in this space and had created really simple, mostly corruption-free type of mechanisms that get resources to communities, that was the most effective way to do that. So I think that what we can take away from this is that simple, effective ways to get resources to communities is the best way to do things, but also to trust communities, to trust that they know best, what they need, who needs what within their community, who's most vulnerable. They're, what you referred to, Nelly, before, the frontline responders, that's who they are. They're the ones that are most likely to effectively use resources sent further down, especially in instances of crisis. I was listening to Zippy speak as well about the participatory budgeting component within the country in Kenya, and that was really interesting because, again, within Spark, we see that the most effective thing is to think through how do you support the governments as well to work through establishing processes and systems that will ensure that, long-term, they're set up to be able to get resources to communities. And so that's the sort of thing that we're committed to as an organization. That's the sort of thing that we've been working on within the different countries that we're operating in. And that's what we're taking forward within the next phase of our work as well.
Thank you, Louise. I think, this experience, reaffirmed for many of you who've been doing this work for a long time that, this is an approach that is effective, it is more efficient, it bypasses sort of all of these different layers and signatures, as you said. I think, we're here talking about how to be, the lessons that we've learned and how to take them forward to be better prepared for future crises and just for more sustainable development generally. And I think, part of what you're saying and what we're seeing is how, where these systems were in place to some degree, you were able to mobilize faster than some of the other systems that stalled or took a long time to sort of pick up their wheels and figure out how to move along. But there's obviously more to do and things that we can be doing better, as you were pointing out. So now, I'm curious to hear from you guys from many different places that you're working. What systems did you have in place that were effective as things ground to a halt, but also where you were pushed, where it didn't work, where you had to lean more, as we've been talking about, on communities and their most local partners?
I'll take the bait on that. I was in India when COVID hit, and it was quite a shock to us. Our board of directors determined that I should return back to the U.S., but that we weren't going to give up on the people. Primarily, our community was that we were in at that particular time was appealing, and the people there were in dire circumstances and needed irrigation as well as drinking water. Our board of directors determined that rather than giving up on the people, that we would fund them remotely. We had a local engineer that was quite capable, where I had been taking charge of everything myself and training people. He took over the training position as well as running the project. We were lucky find such a highly qualified person, that person has continued to train drillers in reverse flow drilling techniques that are capable of drilling large diameter irrigation wells. And we have drilled, I think, 360 wells without any supervision from the United States. We just wire money and execute the project. And I add that he does it very inexpensively. We're averaging at a cost of less than $400 per well. So if we want to replicate that, we're in Guatemala trying to replicate it now, making some local people to and the people of the villages are very supportive of us. So that's how we beat the COVID problem. But of course, we couldn't travel to other countries and set anything up during COVID.
For the U.S. government to hear that. Anyone else? Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
And I think our folks online might have trouble hearing you, so I'll try to paraphrase for them.
Something about how you creating opportunity to align, right? Not intentionally. I think for us, that's sort of too, but then less able to be done in person, and a little bit like pushing the big bird out of the nest. You know, it's like really forced our local leadership. That's what was beautiful about it. And I think for us too, a real learning was how do we take advantage of the resources we have, right? For us, we provide, for example, educational academic support services. But we don't have internet and smart devices in our homes. What do we do? What do we have? We have telephones. And kids can come pick up printed packets, right? So it's like, for us, it was about maybe almost taking a step back and looking at the resources we have and working.
Did you guys hear that online? That's okay. I mean,
No, I did not hear that.
She was talking about how for them it required her team to look at, you know, what the the offices here were doing, and to push themselves and their country teams, not push, they were required, I assume, to, you know, to just go ahead without them. And that it worked, you know, not surprisingly, maybe surprisingly in some cases really well. And that when they sort of like removed that safety net, you know, it was still working. And her other point was also about having to take a step back and think about, okay, what resource, you know, if we can't have all of the resources that used to be part of our toolbox, really thinking about what can they use and leveraging that. And that, well, I'm curious, it leads to my next question, but I'm curious if anybody else has anything they want to. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, nope, just you.
Then we try to give them like doing like a mentorship workshop and things like on the for example, like collaborative, not only like all the time, like providing with so my friends and somehow we get something we can put into the function of the like this programs we quite much like managers because like things that is it a benefit for them? It's a long time if we can advise them. But then still the last time because it's it, yeah.
Awesome, thanks. Again, just for the folks online, he was talking about how he works with a group that's working on access to education, and it's unequal across Indonesia, and so they would go to more remote areas and do training and education access and upskill youths in those areas to be advocates for education, but then when COVID happened, they couldn't go in person. And so they had to figure out a way to take this online. And it sounds like that has led to some really great things. For example, whereas they used to have trouble getting national experts to go to more remote areas, now they could do it online because folks were more used to working through social media and Zoom and all these things, so they were able to connect in that way. On the other hand, you brought up the point that there was less of that emotional connection because it's online. And you were saying how for the government now they're more broadly using both offline and online education, which is great because the infrastructure is unequal across the country. And you hope that goes forward. But on the other hand, there is still IT infrastructure inequality. And so some people have better access to those online resources and some don't, which is also the point you were bringing up. Phew, I hope I got that right. Yeah, go ahead.
I love when somebody talk about resolutions because they can start with a personal issue. What we can do.
use community for to have with the three challenges. First one was the big challenge because partnerships are areas basically we are solvers. And the second one is how we can the end message unity. Because it's first and not one. Report. That challenge. Value, share the value. Opportunity. Say it's no way that this community and touch each other, we can see our faith. Be my faith knowledge. We need so many times. At the same time, we think about your education. We started by that globalization is how we can learn from people who are making it easier. We contact for Mexico, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador. They teach us about the institution. They teach us how girls, young girls, think about the science of technology, promote the bio garden in their homes. This is the result. And also we find a great opportunity, for example, working here in Salon. We know that if we start the owner is a lot of but she recycled and she learned how to recycle from someone. Everybody before the community say, oh, how to recycle. Now, when she learned that recycle is SDG, she took some proud to show to everybody. You know what? Maybe you don't know too much about SDG. Recycle is my grandmother teach me how is SDG. Maybe like 50 years ago, I went to teach my grandchild about SDG. It's the opportunity that technology was the most important issue for people that like their own vision and everyone has about knowledge. Not all know how. That kind of part of their life. States that we try to promote our leadership in the partnership. Some a small company working on for 40 hours, not only for the business, not only, oh, I'm looking for study project. Oh, how we can do something better? Okay, we can do better. Why we don't contact the people in Mexico? Now, this is the university. They can teach us which books are good for kids that have SDG message. So we create a hybrid system, personal online. So we read books with kids in the page. I know this book, I like someone message. Okay, what you create, what you create. Some really like to go find something better than that. Okay, now you know how old are you? 12 years old. How old are you going to be in 20 years old? Okay. These methods that you have now, how do you do for all life? Kids, boys, girls, how to create the future. They go, you know what? Collect books. I'm going to some place to teach kids only for the library. Oh, don't touch. And it is some amazing books that were fall teacher, and she's for Christmas or for Easter actually she started. Her parents say, you know what, I don't want to go for vacations. Can I do my own campaign? I said, you talking about, oh, because I learn from people from other countries from the States, how can I do my own campaign? I want to collect foods and I want to bring kids. When then I want to paint, I want to have some fun with it. So if we feel so excited about her job, she feels excited about the kids' job. Because the kids from 2 or 3 years old, when she asks, okay, what we can do for the environment? And the small kids say, oh, we can recycle. And the old adults in this that don't say recycle, but you're only 3 years old, how do you talk about recycle? Oh, then recycle is when you have something to throw away or something that you can use 2 or 3 times. At that time, people realize that they are Indiana.
Yeah.
We don't have to wait until 2030 to listen.
Yeah.
We can listen now. And we can do that.
Again, for the folks online, she was talking about how they really work around communications on SDGs and particularly involving youth, and how with the pandemic, there was a lot of opportunities that came through technology, both for people to share what they were doing. So she gave an example of someone who, had at a hair salon had been recycling simply because, that's what her grandmother taught her to do. But then she was able to understand that this was part of like the SDG agenda and effort. And then she felt like she was connected to this big global movement. And then she could sort of share that message that way. And in general, how technology was building linkages and partnerships more broadly and helping to make more people be ambassadors for the SDGs. So talking about, being able to work with youth in Mexico and Peru and different places, and how they, we're getting to really understand how the SDGs fit into their lives now and into their imagined futures, in 2030 or when they were adults and could become committed to it and could go out there and try to share to other children, to younger children even, why this was important. So again, this sort of way in which that is really sort of delegating functions and responsibilities to folks, whether it's in remote areas or younger people, but people who maybe didn't, for some reason before COVID, or, that COVID made it the only option to put them in the action responsible position. So and welcome to new folks. Yes, please, do you want to?
My apologies, I had to go out. My apologies, I had to go out because there was an instruction that I need to collect my pass. Otherwise, I will not be able to attend.
Okay.
Which I did. Very interesting presentation. For feminist, my question is in relation to a typical question asking to rural people, which is not dignified. So in that regard, my question is, what is the role of the Research Ethics Committee, and does it process what kind of question needs to be asked? And my second question is, clearly to collect data about the rural situation, we don't need a questionnaire. You stay there 2 days. Mm-hmm. If you live with the villagers, many of the questions can be answered, like whether you have a toilet in the backyard. You don't need to ask at all. Mm-hmm. If you stay in a day, you know that whether they go outside, what they do. So what role the ethics committee, research ethics committee played in screening the questions?
Thank you. And I'm going to ask you guys to answer quickly, because then we're going to do a lightning round at the end.
Well, that kind of leads into your second. That kind of leads into your second question for me about like what an RI do as an I.
Yeah. So I mean, what I want us to get to before we leave the room, and this can be integrated into your response to that question, is just how do we take this forward? I mean, we've talked about a lot of different innovations or things that us and our organizations were pushed into because of COVID, and maybe we already had sort of the infrastructure, maybe it was new infrastructure, but what of that do we want to take us forward as we're defining sort of a new normal, because COVID will probably be with us for a while, but and beyond COVID, but also, what it takes to do that, but also, what are maybe some of the things that we also don't want to take forward with us? Like if we're thinking about lessons, there's all these positive things, but there are also some negative things, like you were bringing up about, not having that emotional connection that comes in person. So how to find that balance. So yes, please do answer his question, but also if you want to integrate some of those thoughts into that.
Yeah, very quickly, because I know we're coming up on time. To your question, RI cannot do that much as an individual organization because there's so much groupthink that is part of the industry right now. If Save the Children does an assessment, we're like, oh my God, we have to do an assessment too, rather than use the data from Save the Children, right? Like that's what I think is some of the beauty of the movement, is that we're all increasingly, being collaborative and saying, your information can be mine and mine can be yours, and there's no egos, and it's about respecting the time of the community. And I loved your point about, if you spend 2 days observing, you probably know, what's going on. You don't have to ask people. And just being smart. Like my very first job when I was in Tanzania, we were doing a multi-sector needs assessment in rural Iringa. And we had to ask people, do you own a car? And they just started laughing at me. They're like, no, I don't even own a bicycle. And but the donor made us ask that question. And I could have looked around and we were the only ones that had a car in that entire village. So I could have answered that question myself. So it's about groupthink. It's about, and it's really about donor accountability. The donors really have us by, they request things that are not necessary because they've always done it that way. And none of us are willing to stand up and say ECHO, UN, USA, no, stop. We're not going to do that anymore. Or give us a valid reason why you're asking for that, why you're asking for these people's time. Otherwise, I'm not going to do it. I don't care. So anyway, as RI, we can just be advocates, but I think it's going to be a concerted effort where enough of us have to stand up and say enough's enough. So
I think for me, what stands out in your question is also who is on this ethics committee, and is the community present during those conversations? And I think for us, when we think about these processes for participatory MEL or participatory monitoring and evaluation, again, it's not just emphasizing community partners as sources of information or informants, but also thought partners in how we understand data outcomes, but even more so in the design and the selection of what we measure, and asking those questions and having conversations about what's relevant, what's the use of this, will this data make its way back into communities? And I think that there should be more of a negotiation and sort of cross dialogue between funders and communities more directly. And I think part of this kind of brings to the point that Luis made of having trust in communities to be able to weigh in on those conversations, and also listening to them when they express a desire to be a part of that. One of the lessons that we heard is also something that was mentioned. Leaning into technology doesn't always mean new technology. I think we were able to really effectively leverage existing technology like WhatsApp, SMS, radio, even broadcast to disseminate information during the pandemic that helped facilitate communication, and these avenues already existed pre-pandemic. We just weren't leveraging them in a way that really was effective. So we're working with Microsoft now on the implementation of access to internet and having these conversations with partners about how we can leverage internet as a resource for development. And some ideas come up around employment, around understanding climate change, but one of the most prevalent themes is having more direct conversation with people that are in this room, for example, funders, ability to represent their voices more directly in conversations about how programs are deployed and what we're measuring. And so I think it's having trust in communities to be able to engage in those conversations, trusting their expertise, and not overcomplicating things as well. So yeah.
And I think there's a point there also just about, this point about respecting people's time. I think, the higher sort of, well, I don't know, the further out you go to offices, in other countries and then to funders, et cetera, like there's also this sense of where they're using their time, and actually probably the most valuable place for them to use their time would be to hear directly from communities, instead of having all of these intermediaries, which actually adds time and adds indicators and adds to the noise. On that, Zippy, I wanted to go back to you quickly and, hear, as you're thinking about the partnerships that you guys have been developing and the new initiatives that have been coming forward, as you move forward, like looking to the future, what do you want to take forward? What kinds of collaborations do you think should continue, but also, what will it, as I said, what will it take? So not just, in your case, it's hearing from funders, but maybe in your case, it's, from the national government. What role do they have to play to make some of these changes permanent?
Thank you very much again. One of the key things to note about Kenya is that Makueni County in the last 2 cycles of devolution has been noted to be a county that has modeled devolution. And one of the indicators was the ability for the county to decentralize the decision-making processes as per the law to the communities through community-led development. And therefore, at national level is the assurance that Makueni County has led in the community-led development programming. And 2 things have been clear through this modeling and learning, that there has been stronger ownership of service delivery. There has been stronger sustainability of projects and utilization of projects, which means that projects are implemented to meet the needs of the people. They are implemented through the people, and including the national government and NGOs serving in the country are able to study from Makueni. A month ago, we hosted the government of Zimbabwe, and it is because they are going through their policy in terms of decentralization and devolution. And it was decided that they should come and study through Kenya, and arriving in Kenya, it was decided that they should come and study from this subnational, because it is noted that we are at the age of demonstrating devolution that works through the principle of public participation. And therefore, the implication is that if we can cement what is happening in Makueni through our collaboration with the Movement for Community-Led Development, then we provide a broader perspective for learning for the entire counties of Kenya, the nation, and state actors serving in Kenya and in Africa, so that there is a multiplier effect of community-led development modeling that has impact on the community's income, livelihoods, ownership, and sustainability of projects. And that is why centrally to that is the School for Community-Led Development, one of its type. The thinking of this school is a sustainability model, so that there is continuous learning, there is continuous benchmarking and peer learning among whoever, even research institutions interested in understanding the model. And inwardly, that research informs our continuous improvement of the public participation model. And therefore, this ensures, and we are confident, even at national level, that this is the way to go for Kenya. And it is because Kenya is committed to the implementation of the objects of devolution. Article 1 of the Constitution of Kenya provides for community-led development. Article 174 of the Constitution provides for the same. Therefore, from where we sit, even at national level and at the sub-national level, the unifying factor is collaborating to ensure the school is accessible to everybody, is accessible to every learner, is accessible to communities, so that there is a permanent change, both on learning within government and learning within NGOs, and learning for communities to be able to take up the responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you. So for you guys, really the proof, the expression, the proof is in the pudding. You guys, you were doing it and there were outcomes that were visible such that, not only your own government, but other governments were seeing it and they want to replicate it. And this school is, a really concrete way to scale that impact and scale that approach. Louise, I know you work with the government and you work on policies to try to, bring this approach, not just in Rwanda, but in other countries that you work in more broadly. How will you take these past 3 years and bring it into that work?
Yeah, thanks, Nelly. So we started out talking about how the solutions are very much, system change driven. That's what we're looking at. And so, we are thinking about how do we invert some of the existing incentives within our government sort of partners that we work with around sort of their perception of, how they engage with communities. At the moment, the incentives and the perceptions are very much within the realm of control. We know better what the communities need, when actually it should be the reverse. The communities understand what their issues are. They know how those issues should be addressed. So essentially, it's trying to work with them to try and change those perceptions, try and invert some of those incentives as well. And Spark, what Spark's done is very much within the demonstration effect type of space, whereby we show that with working with communities, we're able to achieve some really important development outcomes. And we've had government partners come to us and say, well, actually, how do you do it? Can you show us how you do it within these communities? And that's where we want to be, right? And that's where we want to be able to say, okay, this is the ethos. This is what drives, the success that we're seeing within these communities, and also show them how to scale some of these approaches. And so, for example, in the case of Rwanda, we are working with government officials and taking them to places where they can see a CDD project, for example, scaled across the country. So Indonesia is one of the places where we're taking them and showing them and saying, look, this is actually possible. And there are really useful outcomes from this process. So very much within the demonstration effect, and clear understanding that it has to be a system change process, a clear understanding that we're not here to build parallel systems, because that's not sustainable at all. We should be thinking about strengthening government systems or supporting them to put in place the right systems for citizens to be actively engaged and involved within that, within their own development and the development of the country as well. Yeah, so I would say that's in summary, Nelly. I know we're running out of time, what we are actually doing.
Thank you. Yeah, both the impacts of COVID, but also the way forward are really at all of these levels within the organization, at the sector level, across these big global organizations, and then also, at the government side and changing those systems within government and integrating these approaches into government approaches so that they're not two separate ones working, as you said, in parallel, but that it's infused. So yes, as Louise said, we are past time. I don't know how this day is running, so I don't know if you guys have to theoretically run to your next session or not. Okay, so if you have to leave, you can, but if you want to stay on for a few moments and add comments, I know you came late. I'm sorry you didn't get to introduce yourself, but if you want to add something. Can anyone translate from French? She'll try.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I will try to say what I know in French.
Okay.
Alors, alors, d'abord, tout commencer, j'aimerais remercier pour avoir donné l'occasion. Alors, à mon avis, je vais parler de tout et de la façon dont nous pouvons se reconstruire après la période Covid. Alors,
Je peux TIT ou juste à la fin? Should I
Yeah.
translate if I've been?
Whichever's easier for you, I think.
D'accord. Well, to start, thank you for this opportunity
Yeah.
to be able to
Okay.
speak.
I'm going to come back. Yes. Ok. Donc, je disais que je parlerai de la façon dont en Afrique, on a voulu se reconstruire après la période. À mon avis, avant la Covid, il y avait beaucoup d'événements qui font que les gens ne faisaient pas attention à ce qui sont des actifs économiques. Mais aujourd'hui, il faudrait pouvoir donner la priorité à ceux-là qui participent à l'économie du pays.
So before the pandemic, there was not enough attention on the local drivers of the economy. And it does feel like today we are starting to prioritize looking at local.
Par exemple, les agriculteurs, il faudrait pouvoir mettre en place des fonds de santé spécifiquement destinés à eux, de sorte à ce que s'ils tombent malades, on peut rapidement s'occuper d'eux.
So for example, in agricultural, rural agricultural areas, how can we start to focus more on the ones of health so that when someone, they're not going miles and miles to reach health center to get well, so can we start to
Donc, et le plus important, c'est de pouvoir mécaniser l'agriculture, de mettre à disposition des matériels industriels qui permettent à ces agriculteurs de mieux procéder à des opérations.
And especially when we look at more rural agriculture, how can we get the resources to them to become more efficient? So when you're looking, especially at smallholder farmers, how do we get them to?
Voilà, c'est un peu tout ce que je veux dire. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
I think we have to wrap up.
Yes,
But then we get to like the
go. Yes, well, we're gonna, give me 1 second. I'm just gonna say that for folks who do have to leave, including online, please do. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all for coming here today and being here with us. I think there's a couple of folks who just want to keep chatting for a few minutes, so we're gonna maybe stay for a few more minutes in the room, but formally, I just wanted to thank you all for coming and release you to whatever comes next. So
And if you
Thank
want
you.
further contact information, we'll send you the slide deck that she presented.
yeah, we can send you more information about the movement also. Thank you. Yeah, so thanks all.
We are on the